This lesson is going to be on complex numbers. Alright, first of all, let's just do a little bit reviewing. Let's say we have the square root of 9, which is 3. So that means 3 squared equals 9. 3 times 3 equals 9. So if we have the square root of negative 1, which we know is an imaginary number, just like above, then that would mean that I squared would equal negative 1, because I times I would be negative 1. So it's just like same example as square root of 9 and 3. So let's say we had the square root of negative 9, so that means it's the square root of negative 1 times square root of 9. And we know that from up here, and you should remember these two things right here, those two things are very important, that the square root of negative 1 is I, and square root of 1 is 3, so my answer would be 3I. Now you can write it either way, but usually the number comes first as a coefficient. Let's try one more here. Square root of negative 7, so that's the square root of negative 1. Square root of 7, so that'd be I, because the square root of negative 1 is I, or imaginary number. Square root of 7, so that would be my answer right there then. Alright, let's say we had the square root of negative 64x squared. So that is square root of negative 1, square root of 64, square root of x squared. And we know the square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 64 is 8. And the square root of x squared, the square root and the square symbol kind of cancel each other out, so I'm just left with x. So my answer would be 8ix. Let's see, we have the square root of negative 100, x to the 5th. So that's square root of negative 1, square root of 100. Now we're going to break up x to the 5th into a bunch of like x squares. So we're trying to find out how many x squares are there in x to the 5th. Well, there would be x squared, and x. Because the 2, this 2, and that 2, and there's a 1 up there, all add up to 5, so that's how we get x squared, x to the first. So, square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 100 is 10, square root of x squared is x, cross those out, square root of x squared is x, and the square root of x is just the square root of x. Alright, so let's get some things together here. So we have 10I, and the x times x is x squared, and that's square root of x, so that would be my answer there then. Alright, let's say we had square root of 5 times square root of negative 20. So that's going to be the square root of 5. Square root of negative 20 is the square root of negative 1, square root, and I would find factors of 20. I'm hoping that one of my factors is a perfect square, and it does, 4, and the square root of 5. So we have the square root of 5, square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 4 is 2, and square root of 5, we just leave it that way. Now to simplify, get everything together, so square root of 5 and the square root of 5 is 5. Then we have the 2 times the I, clean it up a little bit, so we have 5 times 2, which would be 10I, and that would be my answer. Alright, now let's remember, because we're going to go on to something a little bit different, I times I equals negative 1. So like I said at the beginning, you need to remember that, because anything I squared is going to be negative 1. So let's say we have 8I times 3I. Well, let's put the things together that look alike. So we have the 8 and the 3 times I. So we have 8 times 3 is 24, and we know that I times I is negative 1, so we have times negative 1. And 24 times negative 1 is negative 24, so that would be my answer then. Alright, the next thing we're going to learn is adding complex numbers together. So we have 4 plus 2I minus 1 plus 5i. Alright, so we have 4 plus 2i. This negative has to be distributed to each one of these. So we have negative 1 and then negative 5i. Alright, so now we're going to put the like things together. So we have the 4 and that's negative 1 or minus 1, which would be 3. And then we also have the 2i and the 5i. So that would be minus 3i. So then that would be my answer there. Let's try another one here. So we have 8 minus 5i minus 2 plus I. So we have 8 minus 5i. And again, we have to distribute the negative to each of the terms. So we have minus 2 minus I. We're going to get like terms together. So we have at and that. 8 minus 2 is 6. And then we also have negative 5i and negative 1, so it would be minus 6i. So that would be my answer there. Alright, now the next thing is going to be multiplication. So we have 8 plus 5i times 2 minus 3i. So we're going to apply the FOIL method. So we have to multiply everything in the first factor times everything in the second. So 8 times 2 would be 16, and 8 times negative 3i would be negative 24i. Then we multiply this second term times the first. So we have plus 10i, and then that times that would be negative 15i squared, because I times I is I squared. Alright, so now we know that I squared is negative 1. So really now we have negative 15 times negative 1, and negative 15 times negative 1 is positive 15. So now we have 16 plus the 15, which is 31. Then we have the negative 24, whoops, forgot to put the I in there, and the 10i, and that's going to be negative 14i. So we have 31 minus 14i is negative 24i plus 10i is negative 14i. Let's try another one of those. So we have negative 6 plus 2i times 5 minus 3i. Apply the FOIL method. So that times that first would be negative 30. And that times that would be plus 18i. Then we'll take this second one times the first one, which would be plus 10i. And then that times that would be negative 6i squared. Alright, now we know that I squared is negative 1, so now we have negative 6 times negative 1 there, which would be positive 6. So now we're going to get our like terms together. So the negative 30, the positive 6, which would be negative 24. And then we also have the 18i and the 10i, which is going to be 28i. And I didn't say it before, but when you're adding those together, the i's just act like variables, just like if I had 18x plus 10x. So the i's, when you're adding them together, just act like variables. So you just bring that along. You don't put it to I squared. You only make it I squared when you're multiplying. Alright, our last one would be factoring. So let's say we have x squared plus 81 equals 0. So we're not able to factor that like we would when making a box or anything like that. So we're going to solve for x. So we're going to subtract 81 minus 81. So we have x squared equals negative 81. And we know to get rid of a square, we take the square root of it. So we have to take the square root over here, because the square root and the square cancel each other out. So I'm left with x equals You have to have plus or minus, since it's square root, because you could have two answers. Square root of negative 81. So that's plus or minus square root of negative 1, square root of 81, sorry, almost said the answer. And that equals plus or minus square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 81 is 9. So then my answer would be plus or minus 9I. And we'll do one more of those, and this will be our last example. So 4x squared plus 24 equals 4. So we're going to solve for x. So minus 24 from both sides. So we have 4x squared equals negative 20. Then we are going to divide by 4 because we're solving for x. X squared equals negative 5. And we know to get rid of the square, we can take the square root, because the square root and the square cancel each other out, so we're left x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 5. So that means plus or minus square root of negative 1, square root of 5. And so our answer then would be plus or minus I square root of 5. And that's how I would write it, and that would be our answer. So right there would be our answer. So hopefully this lesson will help you on complex numbers, and good luck to you. Bam!